A note before this one begins. If you find yourself listening to these stories the way some folks listen to rain on a tin roof, for the company of it, for the way it fills the quiet parts of the evening, you might like the full audiobook collection I've put together, gathered from letters and ledgers and the kind of accounts nobody prints anymore. It's linked below, and it's long enough to see you through a winter. There. That's done. Now settle in. There are doors in these mountains that were never meant to be locked, and there are doors that were never meant to be opened, and the trouble in Appalachia has always been that the difference between the two is not written down anywhere. It is carried in the mouths of old women, and in the hesitation of dogs, and in the way a certain kind of silence sits on a porch at dusk. I have been collecting this story for a long time. I found it first in a county ledger in Boone County, and then in a granddaughter's diary that had been kept in a cedar chest for 50 years, and then in the memory of a preacher's boy who is now himself an old man in a rest home outside Charleston. It is a story about a widow who never locked her door, and about what her open door invited in, and about what it eventually gave back. And it is a story, still, in the ridges above Boone County, where they say if you walk the old Ashmore Trace at dusk you will hear a latch lifting that has no door left to lift it from. Tell me, before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one of them, and it always surprises me how far this voice carries. A woman wrote me last week from a hospital in Nova Scotia. A man wrote from a fire tower in Idaho. Somebody wrote from a truck stop outside Amarillo at 3 in the morning, and their comment was only 2 words, and I have thought about it every night since. Tell me the town. Tell me the road. Tell me what the weather is doing outside your window. I like to picture you there. Steadies me for the telling. Her name was Lorabeth Cundiff, and in the fall of 1901 she was 51 years old. She was a small, careful woman with iron-gray hair pinned in a low knot, hands roped with the tendons of 40 years of laundry and canning, and pale gray eyes set deep beneath a brow that seemed always to be listening for something behind her. She wore black, as widows did then, and would for the rest of her life. Her husband, Emmett Cundiff, aged 48, a lay preacher and a maker of wagon spokes, had died the previous January of a lung sickness he'd caught nursing a neighbor through the same. He had been a broad, kind man with a soft voice, blue-eyed, brown-bearded, slow in his temper and quick with his hands, and he had been buried in the little churchyard on the ridge, and Lorabeth had not, in all the months since, gone a single night without leaving her front door unlatched. She did not do this out of grief, though grief was there. She did it because Emmett, in the last days when the fever left him lucid, had held her hand and made her promise. He had told her, in that quiet, stubborn way of a preacher who has done a great deal of listening, that a door locked against strangers is a door locked against the Lord, and that no house in which he had lived would ever refuse a traveler. She had told him she would keep it open. It was the kind of promise you make to a dying man because you cannot bear to argue with him, and then, because you have made it, it becomes a rule. So the latch string on the Cundiff cabin, which had hung inside since Emmett's grandfather had raised the walls in 1849, was pulled outside every night, and every night the door stood as an invitation to whatever weather or wandering thing might come. For 8 months, nothing came that shouldn't have. A tinker slept on the floor in April, and left a mended pot on the table as payment. A boy running from his father slept there in May and was carried home by the sheriff the next morning. In June, Lorabeth's own sister, Odessa Vale, aged 47, walked up from the low farm with a broken heart and a bag of peaches and stayed for a week. Odessa was a rounder, redder woman than her sister, with a laugh like a pan of buttons dropped, brown-haired going gray at the temples, freckled across the nose from a life spent in kitchen gardens, and she had come because her husband's mill had failed and the note on their land had come due, and she needed to borrow against the little Emmett had left. Lorabeth gave her what she had. It left the Cundiff cabin with almost nothing but the flour barrel and the pig. Odessa cried and kissed her sister's forehead, and went back down the mountain, and Lorabeth stood at the open door watching her go, and did not, that night either, pull the latch. That is the ballast of this story, and I want you to hold it. Promise to a dead husband, a sister who needed, a cabin with almost nothing left in it, a door that would not close. You understand. This is not the beginning of the horror. This is the frame around it. The horror begins on the 4th day of October in the year 1901, and it begins so small you could miss it, and by the end of 30 days it will have swallowed the cabin whole and left a story that 99 years later a preacher's boy will still refuse to walk past after dark. On the 4th of October, at some hour past midnight, Lorabeth woke to the sound of the latch string being lifted. The latch string, not the door. The latch string was already outside, hanging down against the boards, where she left it every night. What she heard was the small, particular chuck of the wooden latch inside the door being tripped up and set back down. Not opened, set, as though something had come to the door, tested the mechanism as a man might test a lock he already had a key to, and then, satisfied, left. She lay in the bed she had shared with Emmett for 26 years and did not move. The dog, a red hound named Piper, aged 9, who slept in the kitchen and had never in his life failed to bark at a squirrel, made no sound. She waited until the gray of dawn. Then she got up and looked at the latch. It was down. The string was still outside. Nothing was disturbed. She told herself that morning that it was mice. Mice can lift a latch, she said aloud to Piper, who was sitting under the kitchen table with his ears flat and his eyes on the door. Mice can lift a latch, she said, and Piper did not lift his eyes. On the 5th day she heard nothing. On the 6th day she heard nothing, and she slept badly for having heard nothing because she had been listening. On the 7th day she washed all the windows of the cabin, inside and out, because a woman raised in that country knows that if a house is going to be looked at, the house should at least be clean. She did not know, at the time, that she had begun to keep house for a caller. She would understand it later. She would understand a great many things later. That is the way in these stories. The understanding always comes after the door has already been touched. On the 8th day the sound came twice. Once past midnight, once nearer to dawn. Both times, Lorabeth was already awake, waiting for it. The second time she heard, with the sound of the latch, a soft single knock against the boards of the door itself. One knock, not a rapping, not a summons. A single tap, like a knuckle laid politely against a coffin lid. Piper, on the 8th night, urinated on the kitchen floor. He had not done that since he was a pup. Lorabeth cleaned it up in the dark, on her hands and knees, and did not scold him, because when she came near him he shook so hard she could hear his tags. She sat with him a long time on the kitchen floor in her nightgown, with her hand on the loose skin of his neck, and she felt the fear come off of him in a heat, and she understood, in the way a woman understands these things without needing to name them, that whatever Piper had heard at that door had a particular smell to it, and that Piper had smelled it and known it and been unable to bark. A dog that cannot bark is a dog that has already surrendered. She sat with him until the fire went low. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She kept her hand on him. It seemed important that at least one thing in the house be touched by something warm. There were ways in that country that a widow was expected to behave. She was expected to be received back into her sister's household or her nearest cousin's, or to sell the cabin and move to town, or to marry again within a year of decent mourning. Lorabeth Cundiff did none of these things. She stayed. She left the latch string out. She washed the kitchen floor. She baked bread on Wednesdays and did the wash on Mondays and read her husband's Bible in the evenings by the lamp. And when, on the 10th day, she took the wagon into the crossroads store at Buckhorn to sell her butter, she asked offhand of the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Corinne Baxter, aged 62, sharp-eyed, thin as a rail, with white hair braided down her back and a small silver crucifix worn outside her collar, who had known Emmett since he was a boy. She asked whether Corinne had ever heard of a house being troubled by something that lifted the latch but did not come in. Corinne Baxter did not answer at first. She weighed the butter. She wrote in the ledger. She wiped her hands on her apron. And then she said, without looking up, that there were things a widow ought not to invite, and there were promises a dying man ought not to have asked for, and that she, Corinne, would be by on Sunday after service to speak with Lorabeth in her own kitchen, and not before, and would Lorabeth please, in the meantime, sleep with the Bible open on the pillow beside her. Lorabeth took the butter money and drove home. That night, before she went to bed, she opened Emmett's Bible on the pillow. She could not bring herself to pull the latch string in. Promise is a promise. But she laid the Bible on Emmett's pillow, spine down, pages spread to the 23rd Psalm because she could not think of anywhere better to open it, and she went to sleep. Past midnight, the latch tripped. And then, for the first time, it lifted, and the door swung inward the width of a hand, and stayed there. Nothing came in. Nothing that she saw. The cold October air came in, and the smell of wood smoke from someone stove down the ridge, and the sound of an owl that was too close to the porch to be an owl at rest. And after some minutes, the door swung shut again, gently, without human hand, and the latch fell into place, and the string, which had been outside, was now inside, pulled through, as though a caller had let himself out and locked up behind him. The next morning Lorabeth Cundiff sat at her kitchen table and looked at the latch string coiled neatly on the floor inside her door, and she understood, for the first time, that she was being courted. I want you to sit with that word. Courted. Not haunted. Not threatened. Not besieged. Courted. In the old sense, as a widow is courted, patiently, formally, by a man who has time on his side and knows she is alone. It is worse, somehow, than a haunting. A haunting wants to frighten you off. A courtship wants you to consent. She did not tell Corinne Baxter about the latch string being pulled through. When Corinne came on Sunday, in her black bombazine and her deacon husband in tow, the deacon, a stooped, quiet man named Elias Baxter, aged 65, bald across the top with 2 tufts of white hair over his ears. She found Lorabeth composed at the table with tea already poured, and she took her seat, and she took Lorabeth's small roped hand in her thin one, and she said what she had come to say. You have to understand, Corinne told her, that there are things in these mountains older than the Bible you married, and older than the promise you made, and they have their own manners. There is a courtesy in them, she said, and the courtesy is worse than any wickedness, because the courtesy makes a woman feel she is being asked. The old people, she said, called this particular sort of caller a walker in manners, or sometimes, more plainly, a suitor. It comes to houses where a woman has been left and where the door has been made an offer, and it comes in the form of the smallest possible presumptions. The latch, the knock, the door left ajar, and each presumption is asking a question, and each night the woman is expected to answer no. And if she cannot bring herself to answer no, because she has made a promise, or because she is lonely, or because she is only tired, then the caller takes the silence as yes. And it comes closer, and it comes closer, and the closer it comes, the harder it is to say no, until the night arrives when it is inside, sitting at her table, and by then it is not a caller anymore. It is what the widow is. You have to say no, Corinne told her. You have to pull the latch string in tonight and every night hereafter, and you have to say it aloud. Not think it, not pray it, say it, and you have to say that you do not consent, and you have to do this even if it breaks the promise you made to Emmett, because Emmett, if he could see what has been coming to his door, would not hold you to it. Lorabeth Cundiff listened. She thanked Corinne. She poured more tea. She sat with the deacon a while and let him say a prayer over the room. And when Corinne and the deacon had gone down the trace and their wagon was out of sight, she stood at the door with her hand on the latch string, and she thought of Emmett's hand on hers, and she thought of his voice in the last hour of his life saying, "Promise me," and she could not do it. She left the string out. She would come to understand later that this was not stubbornness and not devotion but a third thing, something older than either, the thing that keeps women in houses that are killing them because a man once asked. Corinne would have called it a sin. Emmett, from wherever he was now, might have called it obedience. Lorabeth called it, in her own head, only keeping. That night, the 12th night, she heard the latch and she heard the door swing wide, and she heard, for the first time, a footstep on her floor. One footstep, just inside the threshold. And then nothing. And then the door closed. Now I have to be careful. I have to be careful because the not telling is part of this story. There are shapes I could give you for what stood on Lorabeth Cundiff's threshold on the 12th night of October, 1901, and every shape I could give you would be smaller than the truth. The old people in that country did not describe it, and the ones who tried later told different stories, and the stories did not agree, and I believe the disagreement is the closest thing to accuracy we have. Something the shape of a tall man in a good coat. Something the shape of a lean woman with wet hair. Something the shape of nothing at all, only a cold place in the doorway that displaced the light. Take your pick. They are all wrong. What is not wrong is the footstep. There was a footstep, and the next night there were 2. Piper the hound stopped eating on the 14th day. He would drink. He would not eat. He lay under the kitchen table with his head between his paws and he watched the door, and when Lorabeth crossed the room he flinched. Not from her. from what he expected to be behind her. On the 14th night she picked him up in her arms, 9 years old and 42 pounds of him, and she carried him to her bed, and he lay against her back all night and did not sleep, and she felt his heart against her ribs the way a woman feels a small clock she has wound too tight. On the 15th day, Odessa Vale came back up the mountain. She came unannounced, on foot, having walked the 7 miles from the low farm because she could no longer afford the buggy horse. She came with a rag over her hair and her hands raw from the wash she had been taking in. And she came, she said, because she had had a dream. She had dreamed of Lorabeth's kitchen. She had dreamed of the door standing open and the room past the door full of a soft, waiting cold, and she had dreamed of Emmett standing in the far corner with his back to her, and she had heard him say, without turning, tell her to close it. She had woken up with the words in her mouth. She had walked, in the dark, before dawn. Her shoes were wet through when she came up onto the porch, and she stood there a long moment before she came inside, looking down at the boards as though she were reading them. Lorabeth did not tell her sister everything. She told her about the latch. She did not tell her about the footstep. Odessa sat at the table and cried, because she loved her sister, and because her own life had come apart in a way that made this new terror feel like the second half of a single long punishment. And then she wiped her face and she said, we will pull the latch string in tonight together and I will stay with you and we will say no. They planned it carefully. That is the thing I want you to hear. They planned it carefully the way careful mountain women plan a hog killing or a canning day. They agreed that at sundown they would pull the string. They agreed that Lorabeth would say aloud, in Emmett's memory and in her own name, that she did not consent. They agreed that Odessa would stay in the front room and Lorabeth in the bedroom, and that if either of them heard the latch they would call the other's name. They agreed that in the morning they would go together to Corinne Baxter, and then to the preacher, and then, if it came to it, to the sheriff. They laid the fire. They ate a supper of cornbread and beans. They did not speak much through it. Odessa lit the lamp. The plan was good. It was a good plan. That is why the story turns here. Because the sun set an hour earlier than they had planned for. I mean this literally. There was a storm coming across the ridge from the west, and it swallowed the light before either of them had thought to look up. The kitchen went dim while Odessa was still washing the plates. The dog under the table made a sound none of us should ever have to hear a dog make. Not a growl, not a whine, something in between, low and continuous, the sound a creature makes when it is watching something enter a room that has not yet arrived. And Lorabeth went to the door to pull the string in, and her hand was on the string, and the latch lifted from the other side. She had not said no yet. She had meant to. She had been about to. The words were already assembling in her mouth. But the latch lifted, and the door came open under her hand, and there in the last gray of the stormlight stood, at the edge of the porch. Not on it, not yet. The shape of a man in a long dark coat, with his hat in his hands, and his face turned politely down toward the boards, the way a suitor stands who has come to be received. Odessa said her sister's name from the kitchen. Once, quietly, just the name. Lorabeth said, aloud, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, no. I do not consent. Emmett, if you are listening, forgive me. I do not consent. And she pulled the door shut with both hands, and she pulled the latch string in through the hole and coiled it inside, and she leaned her forehead against the boards and she wept. And on the other side of the door, quietly, the shape said, in a voice she did not hear with her ears but felt in her teeth very well, have you ever known, in your body, that something was wrong before your mind agreed to it? Have you ever stood in a doorway and felt the air on the other side of it think about you? Have you ever loved someone enough to promise a foolish thing, and then had the foolishness of the promise come home to you in the shape of a bill? I ask because I want you to hold that feeling, the exact texture of it, before I tell you the rest of what happened in the Cundiff cabin, and the rest of what became of Lorabeth, and the rest of what her sister carried down the mountain in the morning. Let's go back to the story. It did not leave. That is the first thing I have to tell you. Saying no did not send it away. What saying no did was move it from the threshold to the yard, and then, over the next several nights, from the yard to the porch, and then from the porch to just outside the door, where it stood without knocking, without lifting the latch, without doing anything at all, only standing. Lorabeth and Odessa slept in the same bed for a week. They took turns pretending to sleep. They heard nothing. That was worse. They heard nothing at all, and yet in the morning the frost on the porch boards would be disturbed in the shape of two boots planted patiently, side by side, facing the door, for the whole of the night. Two boots. Not tracks coming and going. Only the standing. On the 17th day, Odessa went out with a broom and swept the frost from the boot outline, and swept the boards clean and came back inside and shut the door, and looked at her sister and said, "We should not have done that." She was right. That night the outline was there again, in the same place, and it was deeper. On the morning of the 18th day it was deeper still, and there was, for the first time, a small semicircle scuffed in the frost just ahead of the toes of the boots, the kind of mark a caller leaves who has been shifting his weight, patient but no longer entirely still, the way a man will shift on his feet when he has been kept waiting on a porch a long time and is beginning, politely, to feel it. On the 19th day, a peddler came up the trace, an old peddler named Hutchins Beam, aged around 70, gap-toothed, gray-bearded, wallied in his left eye from a mule kick when he was young, a man Lorabeth had known for 20 years. He would not come onto the porch. He stood in the yard with his pack on his back and would not step up. He said the porch had a feel to it he did not like. He would not take coffee. He would not sell them anything. He said from the yard that he was sorry, and that he would come back in the spring, and he turned his mule around and went. Lorabeth stood at the door and watched him go, and Odessa stood behind her, and neither of them said what they both knew, which was that Hutchins Beam had known this ridge for 50 years and had drunk coffee at every cabin on it. And if Hutchins Beam would not step onto their porch, no one else was going to either. In the spring he did come back, and he sat at their table and drank coffee like nothing had happened. And neither of them asked him what he had felt, and he did not offer to say. He is buried now in the churchyard at Buckhorn. His stone says only his name. On the 20th day the cat that had come with the cabin, a mean gray barn cat named Whistle, aged about 6, went missing and was not seen again. Lorabeth looked for her in the barn and in the smokehouse and along the fence line, and she called for her at dusk, and she did not find her. Odessa said gently, "Do not call at dusk anymore." Lorabeth did not call at dusk anymore. On the 21st day, Piper the hound died. He was not sick. He was not old, not by hound years. He simply went out onto the porch at dawn, walked to the exact spot where the boot prints ended, lay down inside their outline and stopped breathing. Odessa buried him in the garden. Lorabeth could not go outside for it. She stood at the window and watched her sister dig, and she pressed her hand against the glass, and when Odessa came back inside her hands were dirty and her cheeks were wet and she did not say a word for the rest of the afternoon. On the 23rd day, Odessa went, on Lorabeth's insistence, back down the mountain. It was harvest and she had children of her own, and Lorabeth said, more firmly than her sister had ever heard her, that this was her house and her promise and her caller, and that she would sit with it alone. That was the wrong decision. I want to be honest about that. Corinne Baxter later said it was the wrong decision, and the preacher said it was the wrong decision, and even Odessa herself, in the diary she kept for the rest of her life, wrote that she should not have gone. But you have to understand what it is to be a widow who has said no for the first time in her marriage, and to feel, in her chest, that the saying of it is the only real thing left in the house. Lorabeth Cundiff wanted to be the one who kept the door shut. Alone. She earned it. She had earned it in 26 years of a good marriage in which she had never once, not once, been asked what she wanted for herself only. She was 51 years old and she wanted to sit alone with the thing she had said no to, and see what it did. For 7 nights after Odessa left, the shape stood on the porch and did not knock. Lorabeth kept the lamp lit. She read the 23rd Psalm aloud each evening at the table, once, and then she went to bed, and she did not sleep, and she rose at dawn and looked at the frost. The outline, the outline, the outline, each morning deeper, each morning closer to the door. On the 27th morning the outline was pressed up against the threshold itself, boots almost touching the boards, as though the caller had leaned forward in the night without stepping. On the 8th night after Odessa left, the 30th day of October, it did knock. One knock, polite, a knuckle on wood. Lorabeth was at the kitchen table with Emmett's Bible open in front of her and the lamp turned low. She heard the knock. She did not stand up. She said aloud to the door, "I do not consent. I did not consent on the 15th night, and I do not consent tonight, and I will not consent. Not while I am living in this house." There was a long pause. And then, on the other side of the door, a voice she recognized said, "Lorabeth, let me in. It's cold." It was Emmett's voice. I have told this story to grown men who have wept at this part, and to old women who have set their jaws and stared at the fire. I have to tell it plainly, because there is no other way. Lorabeth Cundiff sat at her table for a long time. Long enough for the lamp to burn low. Long enough for the fire to fall to coals. And her husband's voice on the other side of her door called her name and asked her, in the exact particular cadence he had used when he came home in the winters, to please Lorabeth, let him in. It was cold. She did not open the door. That is the thing I want you to hold on to. She did not open it. But she did stand up. She did walk to it. She did lay her palm against the boards on her side. And she did whisper, "Emmett, if it is you, forgive me. And if it is not you, forgive me anyway." And the voice on the other side said, "Lorabeth." And she pulled her hand back. She sat by the door until dawn. The voice did not speak again after she pulled her hand back. She heard, once, near the end of the night, something like a sigh. Not sorrowful, not angry, only tired. The way a caller might sigh who has been kept standing on a porch too long, and then nothing. When the gray came up in the window and she could see her own hands, she got up and she put on her cloak and she opened the door. There was no one there. There were no boot prints on the porch. The frost was undisturbed. The latch string was outside, and she did not remember pulling it back through. She walked to Corinne Baxter's that morning, 7 miles on foot in the frost, and she told Corinne the whole of it. Corinne did not scold her. Corinne made her sit down and drink tea and eat 2 biscuits, and then Corinne did something I have not been able to fully reconstruct, and I have tried. Corinne sent for a man who lived across the county line, an old man named Silas Renfrew, aged around 78, thin, white-bearded, half Cherokee on his mother's side, with a face like a piece of walnut that had weathered outside for 8 decades, who had been, in the way of that country, both a Baptist deacon and something else that people did not name aloud. He came on a mule the next morning. He did not ask Lorabeth many questions. He walked around the cabin 3 times, always going right to left, and he laid something small on each of the 4 thresholds, the front door, the back door, the cellar, and the loft, and he told Lorabeth she was not to touch what he had laid down, and she was not to speak of it to anyone, and she was to keep the front door latched at night for the rest of her life, and she was to leave every evening at dusk, 1 lit lamp burning in the front window until morning. He said it would not stop coming. But it would not, he said, come any closer than the porch. Not now. Not with the door shut and the lamp lit and the small things laid down. The door had been closed in time. She had said no in time. Not by much, but in time. He said one more thing. He said it standing in the yard with one hand on the mule's neck, looking not at Lorabeth but past her, at the porch. He said, "Ma'am, I want you to understand what you did on that 30th night. You did not slam the door. You did not curse it. You did not pray at it. You laid your palm on the boards and you spoke to it as if it were a person, and then you pulled your hand back. That is the old way. That is the way my grandmother's people did it when they still had the words for it. Most folks these days would have opened the door to try to see, or slammed it in a rage, and either would have counted as an answer. Yours did not. Yours counted as a refusal without an insult. That is the only kind of no this kind of caller respects. You are going to be all right." He nodded once and he got up on the mule and he rode back across the county line. He would not take payment. He drank a cup of coffee. He rode back across the county line, and the sun was on his back, and he did not turn around. Lorabeth watched him from the porch, and she did not go inside until his mule was small in the distance, and when she did go inside, she latched the door for the first time in 9 months, and the sound of the latch dropping into its notch was the loudest sound she had heard in her own house since Emmett died. She stood in the kitchen with her hands still on the wood, and she said aloud to no one, "I am sorry, Emmett." And then she said, "And I am not sorry, Emmett." And she meant both of them, and both of them were true, and that is the way of a promise broken for good reason. It sits in you for the rest of your life as 2 things at once, and you carry both and you do not resolve them, and eventually the carrying of both is what love is. For the rest of her life, and Lorabeth Cundiff lived another 29 years, dying in the winter of 1930 at the age of 80. She left a lamp burning in the front window from dusk to dawn. She latched her door at sundown. She did not speak ever again of what had come to it. She wore black. She did not remarry. She took in her sister's youngest daughter, a girl named Verba Vale, aged 11 when she came, brown-haired, brown-eyed, freckled, quiet, and raised her, and Verba grew up in that cabin and kept the lamp in the window herself. On the nights Lorabeth was too tired to rise, and Verba, when she was an old woman, taught her own granddaughter to do the same. Every year, on the anniversary of the 30th of October, Lorabeth Cundiff took out Emmett's Bible and read the 23rd Psalm aloud once, from beginning to end, at the kitchen table with the door latched and the lamp lit, and then she closed the Bible and did not speak for the rest of the night. Verba, when she was old enough to notice, noticed. Verba, when she was old enough to ask, did not ask. It was, Verba wrote in the diary I found 70 years later, the one private thing my aunt did, and she did it in front of me, and I never once asked her what it meant because I understood from very early that some things you sit with and do not question. That is the ritual. That is what outlived the caller. That is what I want you to hold on to. An old woman at a table in Boone County once a year in October, reading the 23rd Psalm aloud to a latched door and a lit lamp, from 1901 until 1930, and then a niece continuing it until 1974, and then a great-niece, if the family story is to be believed, still doing it in a house in Kentucky as recently as the summer I was writing this down. Now here is the confirmation part, because I know some of you are waiting for the part where the world says, "Oh, that was only a story, that was a widow's grief, that was a bad dream in a bad month." I have to tell you the world did not say that. The world said something worse. In the spring of 1902, 6 months after the 30th of October, a man rode up the ridge to the Cundiff cabin. He said his name was Mr. Halston. He said he was from a company called Halston and Whitcomb Land and Estate Recovery, out of Lynchburg, Virginia. He wore a good coat. He carried a leather case. He said that a claim had been filed on the Cundiff property, and that his firm was in the business of adjudicating such claims, and that he understood a caller had come to the property in October of the previous year, and that his firm would like, in the interest of orderly settlement, to formally receive Mrs. Cundiff's response. Lorabeth did not open the door. She spoke to him through it. She said, "I do not consent." She said it 3 times. Mr. Halston, on the porch, thanked her politely, tipped his hat which she could not see, and rode back down the mountain. 6 weeks later, Odessa Vale, because Lorabeth had written her a letter about it, and Odessa had been alarmed, wrote to the State Records Office in Richmond to inquire about the firm of Halston and Whitcomb. She wrote to the Lynchburg City Directory. She wrote to the Virginia Bar. She wrote to 3 separate lawyers. There was no Halston and Whitcomb Land and Estate Recovery. There was no Mr. Halston. There was no such firm registered in the state of Virginia, or in the state of West Virginia, or in the state of Kentucky. There was no record of the claim he said had been filed. The City Directory of Lynchburg for 1901 and 1902 contains no such name. The Virginia Bar has no listing. There is a Halston Road in Bedford County, and there was, in 1873, a man named Halston who kept a livery there and died childless. And that is the closest I have been able to come, in 20 years of looking, to a Mr. Halston who might have ridden up the ridge to Lorabeth Cundiff's cabin in the spring of 1902 to formally receive her refusal. He came, and he was received, and he did not exist. That is the world's confirmation. It is not much. It is not a photograph or a body or a signed affidavit. But it is a name in no directory, a firm in no register, a claim in no book. It is the polite bureaucratic outside world admitting, by its silence, that something had ridden up that ridge to close out an account it did not have the paperwork for. Corinne Baxter died in 1914. She left, in a small wooden box on her kitchen mantel, a folded page in her own handwriting listing the 4 things Silas Renfrew had laid down at the 4 thresholds of the Cundiff cabin. The page has been lost. I have looked. Verba Vale, who inherited the box, remembered the page as a girl but could not remember the 4 items when she was asked in 1969. She remembered only that one of them was a nail bent into a small hoop, and one of them was a folded page torn from a book she could not identify, and that the other 2 she had never been shown. She said Corinne had told her, once, that the 4 things together were less than half of what would have been laid down in 1830, and that the country had been forgetting how to lay these things. Down for as long as she had been alive, and that Lorabeth had been lucky, and that luck was not a thing you got twice. Silas Renfrew died in 1908. He is buried on his own place across the county line. His grave is marked with a fieldstone. There is nothing carved on it. The mule outlived him by 3 years. Odessa Vale lived until 1936. Her mill was never rebuilt. Her husband died in 1919 of a stroke. She kept the diary I have referenced, and she kept it every day, and the entry for the 30th of October, 1901, is 1 line long. Sister said no. I was not there. God forgive me. And then, in a different ink, added later, God forgive me for going home. The entry for the following October, and every October after that until she died, is the same 1 line. Lit a lamp for Lorabeth tonight. Read the psalm. Latched the door. She did this in her own house, 7 miles down the mountain, from 1902 until 1935, 34 consecutive Octobers, and she did it in front of her children, and her children did it in front of theirs, and there is a house in Charleston, West Virginia, right now, in this year I am telling you this, in which a woman I have spoken to on the telephone but never met still lights a lamp on the 30th of October and reads the 23rd Psalm aloud to a latched door, and she does not know why, only that her mother did it and her grandmother did it, and there was somewhere back in the family an aunt who had needed it done for her. Emmett Cundiff, of course, was already dead. He had been dead since January. He had never come home in the winter to a latched door and asked to be let in because it was cold. That, Lorabeth wrote in the one letter she ever wrote about the matter, a letter she wrote to her sister in 1922 and asked Odessa to burn, and which Odessa did not burn. That was the thing that told her on the 30th night that whatever was on the porch was not her husband. Because Emmett, she wrote, had never once, in 26 years of marriage, said the word cold aloud in her hearing. He had been raised by a father who called it weakness. He would have said the wind was up, or that it was a hard evening, or that the frost had come early. He would never have said, Lorabeth, let me in, it's cold. And she knew that, standing at the door with her palm on the boards, and that is why she pulled her hand back. You understand? The thing on the porch had done its research. It had done nearly enough research. It had learned the cadence, and the pitch, and the particular tenderness of the way her husband said her name. It had learned the way he asked instead of demanded. It had learned the small pause between the please and the name. It had learned everything except one small word he would never have used. And that one word saved her. I think about that a great deal in the writing of these stories. I think about the small privacies of a long marriage, the words a person will not say, the gestures they will not make, the tenderness they reserve for one and the tenderness they refuse to any other. And I think about how those small privacies are, in the end, the only real proof we have of who we loved. Photographs fade. Ledgers burn. Names come off of stones. But the word your husband would never have said is the word by which you know him, 29 years after he is dead, calling to you through a locked door. Lorabeth Cundiff, in her ordinary and unremarkable life, in her small mountain cabin, in one moment on a cold night in October, knew her husband by the word he refused to use. That is a love story. I want you to hear that. Underneath the horror, this is a love story. The horror is only what came to try to steal it. Lorabeth Cundiff is buried beside Emmett in the Ridge churchyard. Her stone is small. It says her name and her dates, and beneath them, in a hand that Verba wrote out for the stonecutter, it says only, she kept the lamp. If you go up there now, the church still stands, though services have moved down to the crossroads. You will find the 2 stones close together, and you will find, sometimes in October, a small kerosene lantern set on the grass between them, lit at dusk by somebody in the family who I have never been able to identify and who has asked, through an intermediary, that I not try. I have honored that request. I mention it only because it is the kind of detail I would want you to know if you were standing there yourself. The cabin still stands too. The road up to it has grown over. The county surveyor's map from 1978 marks it as abandoned. It is not abandoned. Someone every October walks up that grown over trace and lights a lamp in the front window, and latches the door, and walks back down before dark. I have not been up there. I have been asked not to. I honor that request too. The people in Boone County who know the story do not tell it often, and when they tell it in low voices, and they tell it with a small particular gesture, the right hand laid flat against the tabletop, palm down as though closing a book, that I have come to understand is what they do instead of pulling a latch string in. They are saying no in their bodies on Lorabeth's behalf one more time. I have seen an old man do it in a diner in Charleston in the middle of an ordinary breakfast, when someone at the next table mentioned an unrelated house. He did it without knowing he had done it. His hand knew before his mouth did. I have another story for you for another evening about a set of stone steps in the hills of eastern Kentucky that lead down to a river that no longer runs there, and about the family who, for 4 generations, has been counting them, and about the night the count came out wrong. I will tell it to you when the season is right. Until then, I want you to think about this one. I want you to think about what a promise costs. I want you to think about what it means to say no to a voice that knows your name. And if you have your own story, a widow's story, a door story, a lit lamp in a window story that your grandmother told you and you have never known what to do with, I would like to hear it. Write it down in the comments. Send it to me. It might just become the next story I tell here, and if it does, I will read your name aloud when I tell it and you will know. I have read some of yours already in past episodes, and there are people in the comments of this channel who now know each other by their grandmother's stories. And that is, I think, the closest thing to community this modern life still offers us. Latch the door. Light the lamp. And if a voice you love calls to you from the other side of it and asks to be let in because it's cold, listen for the one word your beloved would never have said. Listen for it. And then gently pull your hand back. Do not answer the door on a cold night in October if the voice on the other side has learned a word your beloved would not have used. Do not answer even if the voice knows your name, especially if the voice knows your name. Be the one who keeps the lamp.